Imagine the final, chaotic days of the Second World War. The Third Reich is collapsing, the Soviet Red Army is advancing relentlessly from the east, and a state of panic desperation has gripped the German province of Lower Silesia. In the dying light of a winter afternoon in 1945, amidst the confusion of retreating armies and fleeing civilians, a single, heavily armoured Nazi train is said to have left the city of Breslau, modern-day Wrocław. But this was no ordinary train. According to the legend, its sealed wagons were not filled with troops or munitions, but with a treasure of almost unimaginable value. Tons of gold bullion from the Reichsbank, priceless art plundered from Polish museums, crates of jewels, and perhaps even the lost panels of the Amber Room. Its destination was a secret, a place of safety in the rugged, mysterious landscape of the Owl Mountains. The train was seen entering a valley, heading towards a hillside, before it rumbled into the mouth of a secret, man-made tunnel and vanished. The tunnel, the legend says, was then blown up and sealed, entombing the train and its golden cargo forever.
This is the story of the Polish gold train, a legend that has haunted the region for over 70 years. It is a ghost on the rails, a tale whispered by local treasure hunters and historians, a final, tantalizing secret from the collapse of an evil empire. The story is given a chilling plausibility by its location. The Owl Mountains were the site of one of the Nazis' most ambitious and mysterious construction projects, a vast, top-secret network of underground tunnels and chambers known as Project Riese, or Project Giant. Built by the forced labor of thousands of concentration camp prisoners, its true purpose remains a mystery, but many believe it was intended to be a series of bomb-proof underground factories for secret weapons, or even a final, fortified headquarters for Hitler himself. In a landscape already riddled with secret, man-made caverns, the idea of one more hidden tunnel, containing a lost train, does not seem so far-fetched. For decades, the story remained just that, a story. But in August of 2015, the legend exploded onto the world stage. Two amateur researchers, a Pole named Piotr Koper and a German named Andreas Richter, announced to the world that they had found it. After years of painstakingly correlating old maps, local testimony, and historical records, they had used ground-penetrating radar to scan a specific railway embankment near the 65th kilometer of the Wrocław line, and the images that came back seemed to be the confirmation of every treasure hunter's wildest dream. There, buried 30 feet beneath the earth, was a long, linear anomaly, the distinct, unmistakable shape of an armored train, resting in what appeared to be a collapsed, hidden tunnel. Tonight, our journey is not just about the hunt for Nazi gold. It is a story about the immense power of a legend and the slow, grinding, and often tedious reality of trying to prove it. This is the story of a 10-year obsession. We will explore the methodical scientific process of geological surveys and radar analysis. We will descend into the tedious but necessary world of legal battles for permits and the complex bureaucracy of a modern excavation. We will examine the cold, hard logistics of wartime railways to ask if the legend was ever even possible. And finally, we will follow the diggers as they spend a decade of their lives and millions of dollars to answer the question, only to be met with the profound, anticlimactic silence of the earth. This is the story of the Polish gold train and the great excavation disaster it inspired. A legend forged in chaos, the origins of the gold train myth. Legends like that of the gold train are not born in times of peace and order. They are forged in the crucible of chaos, in the desperate, final moments of a collapsing world, when official records are burned, eyewitnesses are scattered, and the normal rules of reality are suspended. To understand the myth of the gold train, we must first transport ourselves to the terrifying and surreal landscape of Lower Silesia in the winter of 1944 and early 1945. It was a world on the brink of apocalypse. The seemingly invincible German war machine was being crushed, and the Soviet Red Army, a force fueled by a righteous and brutal desire for vengeance, was advancing relentlessly from the east. The city of Breslau, the ancient capital of Silesia, was declared a festung, a fortress city, ordered by Hitler to be defended to the last man and the last bullet. This declaration turned the city into a magnet for the region's treasures. As German civilians and officials began their panicked evacuation westwards, vast quantities of wealth were consolidated in Breslau for safekeeping. This wasn't just military hardware. It was the entire material and cultural wealth of a nation on the run. Gold bullion from the Breslau branch of the Reichsbank was moved into underground vaults. Priceless art collections, ancient manuscripts, and museum treasures from all over Eastern Germany were crated up and shipped to the city, which was believed to be an impregnable fortress. And, most grimly, there was the plunder crates of gold, silver, and personal valuables stolen from the region's wealthy families and the Jewish populations who had been systematically dispossessed and murdered. By early 1945, the fortress was completely encircled by the Red Army. The only way to get this immense, concentrated hoard of treasure out of the city and away from the advancing Soviets was by rail, on heavily guarded, armored trains that could run the gauntlet of partisan attacks and aerial bombardment. It is from this documented, historical reality that the legend of the Gold Train was born. The story is not a complete fantasy. It is an extrapolation of real events. We know that several such trains did attempt to leave the besieged city, heading west towards the relative safety of the mountains. The legend posits that at least one of these trains, the most valuable of all, never made it to its final destination. The myth was given a powerful and plausible anchor by the existence of the mysterious Project Riese tunnel complex in the nearby Owl Mountains. This network of secret, unfinished tunnels provided the perfect, logical destination for a train that needed to vanish from the face of the earth. For decades after the war, the story was kept alive not by official documents, but by whispers, by the fragmented and unreliable memories of the last survivors of that chaotic time. It was told by former German railway workers and Polish miners who came to the region after the borders were redrawn. It was a ghost story, a piece of local folklore, a tantalizing tale of a treasure that was almost certainly real, and a secret hiding place that was verifiably true. It was this potent combination of fact and folklore that gave the legend its enduring and obsessive power. The Deathbed Confession, a treasure map from the past. For decades after the war, the story of the Gold Train remained a ghost, a piece of local folklore, whispered in the mining taverns and villages of Lower Silesia. It was a tale without a map, a legend without a specific location, and therefore a treasure hunt without a starting point. But in the 1990s, a crucial new piece of the puzzle emerged, a dramatic and tantalizing clue that would eventually transform the myth from a vague legend into a tangible, obsessive quest. The secret, it was claimed, had been passed down from a dying man. The story of the modern search begins with a local Polish man, a retired miner and passionate amateur historian named Tadeusz Słowikowski, who had dedicated much of his life to researching the mysteries of Project Riese and the legends of his region. According to Słowikowski, he was entrusted with a secret that had been preserved for 50 years. The story came from a former German railway worker who, on his deathbed, felt compelled to unburden his soul. He confessed that he had been part of the team that had hidden the fabled train in the final days of the war. The confession was incredibly specific. The dying man claimed the train had been driven onto a specially constructed, short siding that led directly into a man-made tunnel dug into the side of a railway embankment. He described how, once the train was inside, the entrance to the tunnel was blown up with powerful explosives, and the track leading to it was removed and covered over, completely erasing any sign of its existence from the landscape. He even provided the crucial location, a specific, unassuming railway embankment near the 65th kilometre of the track between Wrocław and Wałbrzych. The secret was then passed to another local German man, who, in his old age, finally passed the story and a hand-drawn map to Słowikowski. This was the catalyst. It was the missing piece that turned a ghost story into a concrete mission. The two men who would later lead the Great Excavation, Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter, became aware of this story circulating in the local treasure hunting community. Armed with this specific, compelling, and seemingly credible testimonia, treasure map and a story passed down from a man who was there, they now had a target. They were no longer just chasing a myth. They were following the final instructions of an eyewitness. This deathbed confession was the spark that would ignite a multi-million-dollar, decade-long obsession. An obsession that would soon capture the attention of the entire world. The war of paper navigating the bureaucratic maze for permits. To possess a secret map to a legendary treasure is one thing. To actually be allowed to put a shovel in the ground in the modern world is another entirely. Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter, armed with their deathbed confession and a tantalizing radar image, were about to discover that the greatest obstacle standing between them and the gold train was not a collapsed tunnel or a Nazi booby trap, but a mountain of paperwork, a labyrinth of government regulations, and a slow, grinding war against bureaucracy. The romantic, old-world quest for a lost treasure had collided with the tedious, methodical reality of the 21st century. Their first strategic move was to go public. In August of 2015, they hired a lawyer and filed an official claim with the district council in Wałbrzych. They announced to the authorities that they had pinpointed the location of an armored train and, as per Polish law, were requesting a 10% finder's fee in exchange for revealing its exact location. This was a calculated gamble. It was an attempt to legitimize their search and partner with the state. But it also meant their secret was now out. The filing of this single legal document was the spark that ignited a global media frenzy and, simultaneously, awakened the sleeping giants of Polish bureaucracy. Suddenly, the simple act of digging a hole became a matter of national importance, involving a host of competing government agencies, each with its own set of rules and concerns. First, the local government in Wałbrzych, while publicly excited about the potential tourism boom, was now responsible for the site's security. Then, the national government in Warsaw, through the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage, had to get involved. They were publicly skeptical, but legally obligated to investigate any claim of a potential historical treasure of national significance. Their primary concern was not the gold, but the historical preservation of the site, and they insisted that any work be done according to strict, slow-moving archaeological protocols. Because the object in question was a military train from the Second World War, the Polish military was called in. Their bomb disposal units had to survey the entire area for the very real possibility of unexploded ordnance, mines, or chemical weapons that might have been on the train or used to seal the tunnel. This added a layer of genuine danger and slowed the entire process down to a crawl. Furthermore, the location itself was on a working railway embankment, the property of the Polish State Railways, the PKP. Any excavation would disrupt train traffic and posed a potential risk to the integrity of the main line, requiring a whole separate and incredibly complex layer of engineering assessments, surveys, and permits. This was the beginning of the War of Paper, a long and frustrating period of endless meetings, conflicting jurisdictions, and legal challenges that would delay the start of any real excavation for nearly a year. The two treasure hunters, who had started as free agents chasing a legend, were now enmeshed in a complex and costly web of modern regulations, their quest for gold momentarily lost in a blizzard of official stamps and sealed envelopes, mapping the unseen detailed geological survey procedures. Before a single shovel could break the earth, the legend of the gold train had to pass through the cold, impartial filter of modern science. The Polish authorities, as part of the permitting process, mandated a series of non-invasive geological surveys. The goal was twofold. Firstly, to see if there was any credible, scientific evidence of a large, man-made object buried beneath the embankment, and secondly, to map the subterranean landscape to ensure the safety of any future excavation. The romantic, chaotic story of a lost Nazi treasure was now subjected to the slow, methodical, and deeply boring procedures of a geological investigation. The first step was to create a meticulous grid across the entire search area, Scientists and surveyors walked the site in slow, deliberate lines, their boots crunching on the gravel of the railway embankment. They carried magnetometers, sensitive instruments that measure minute variations in the Earth's magnetic field. The theory was simple: a massive, buried object made of iron and steel, like an armored train, would create a significant and easily identifiable magnetic anomaly, a loud spike in the data against the quiet magnetic background of the natural Earth. For days they walked these grids, the magnetometer humming its quiet tune, slowly, painstakingly, building a magnetic map of what lay beneath their feet. Next came the resistivity survey. This involved driving a series of metal probes into the ground at precise, measured intervals. A small, controlled electrical current was then passed between the probes. Different materials conduct or resist electricity in different ways. The dense, damp soil would have one level of resistance. The underlying bedrock would have another. A large, hollow metallic object, or a collapsed man-made tunnel, would produce a reading that was completely different from the surrounding geology. The process was slow and repetitive, a tedious sequence of hammering probes, taking readings, pulling the probes out, and moving to the next point on the grid, all to build a picture of the Earth's electrical properties. Finally, they employed seismic refraction. A heavy steel plate was placed on the ground, and it was struck with a sledgehammer to create a small, controlled shock wave, a miniature earthquake. A series of sensitive listening devices, called geophones, were laid out in a line to record the exact time it took for this seismic wave to travel through the ground and reach them. The waves would travel at a predictable speed through the topsoil, and at a different, faster speed through the denser bedrock below. Any significant anomaly, a large void, a collapsed tunnel, or a massive dense object like a train would bend, slow, or reflect these waves in a way that the geophones could detect. It was another slow, methodical process, a way of using sound to see in the dark. The results of all these surveys were ambiguous. They confirmed that the ground beneath the embankment was not uniform. There were anomalies, disturbances, and areas of different density, but they could not definitively say, "There is a train here." For the skeptics, this was proof of nothing. But for the believers, this was all the confirmation they needed. The science had shown that something was there. The digital ghost ground penetrating radar and the tantalizing anomaly. The geological surveys were complete. They had provided a wealth of data, a series of complex maps showing the magnetic and electrical properties of the Earth beneath the embankment. They had confirmed that the ground was not uniform, that there were indeed disturbances and anomalies beneath the surface. But they could not provide a clear picture. They had hinted at a secret, but they had not revealed its shape. To do that, the searchers needed a more sophisticated tool, a technology that could, in effect, take a photograph of the darkness, a form of digital archaeology that could transform the ambiguous data into a clear and compelling image. This is the role that was played by ground-penetrating radar, or GPR. The technology is ingenious. A GPR unit sends short, powerful pulses of radar energy into the ground. As these waves travel downwards, they bounce off different materials at different speeds. An echo will bounce off a layer of rock, another will bounce off a pocket of trapped water, and, most importantly, a very strong echo will bounce off a large, metallic object. A sensitive antenna on the surface listens for these returning echoes, measuring the exact time it takes for them to come back. A powerful computer then processes this data, assembling the thousands of individual echoes into a two-dimensional or three-dimensional image of what lies beneath the surface. Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter had access to this technology. They brought their GPR equipment to the now famous 65th kilometer of the railway line, the precise location pinpointed by the deathbed confession. They began the slow, methodical process of scanning the embankment, their eyes glued to the screen as the digital image of the Earth's interior was slowly built up, line by line, and then they saw it. At a depth of about 30 feet, an anomaly appeared that was so clear, so distinct, and so perfectly aligned with the legend that it seemed almost too good to be true. The radar image appeared to show a long, horizontal, tunnel-like void, and within that void, there was a distinct, rectangular shape, over 300 feet long. It was not a natural formation. It had the clear dimensions and the sharp metallic signature of a train. The data was so detailed that the researchers claimed they could even make out the shapes of gun turrets and cannon platforms on the armored wagons. This was the smoking gun. This was the digital ghost. The image went viral, broadcast by news agencies around the world. It transformed the search from a local legend into a global media event. It was this single, tantalizing, and deeply compelling image that finally convinced the Polish authorities and the world that the stories were true. It was the final piece of evidence needed to justify the immense cost and effort of a full-scale excavation. Project Riese technical breakdown of Nazi underground construction. The tantalizing radar image of a buried train would be easy to dismiss as a fantasy, were it not for one profound and terrifying historical fact: the landscape of the Owl Mountains is a honeycomb. Beneath the quiet, forested hills lies a vast and secret world, a testament to the megalomania and desperation of the Nazi regime in the final years of the war. To understand why the legend of the gold train is so believable, one must first understand the very real and very mysterious Nazi endeavor known as Project Riese, or Project Giant. By 1943, the strategic situation for Germany had changed dramatically. Allied bombing raids were becoming increasingly effective, pounding German cities and industrial centers into rubble. In response, the Nazi leadership initiated a massive, top-secret program to move their most critical war production into bomb-proof, underground facilities. Project Riese was the largest and most ambitious of these undertakings. The hard gneiss rock of the Owl Mountains in Lower Silesia was chosen as the location for a series of 7 vast, interconnected subterranean complexes. The construction was a masterpiece of brutal engineering and an act of unimaginable human cruelty. The workforce consisted of thousands of forced laborers, primarily Jewish prisoners, from the nearby Gross-Rosen concentration camp and other surrounding camps. Working in horrific conditions, these men were tasked with one of the most difficult construction jobs on Earth: tunneling through solid mountain rock. The process was a slow, methodical, and deadly cycle. Teams of specialists would drill a series of holes into the rock face, which were then packed with explosives. After the blast, the prisoners would be sent into the unstable, dust-filled darkness to haul out the tons of rubble, often with little more than their bare hands and small mining carts. As the tunnels were cleared, they were reinforced with immense amounts of concrete, creating vast, arched caverns and miles of secure, underground corridors. The sheer scale of the project is staggering. It is estimated that over 2 million cubic meters of rock were excavated. But the ultimate purpose of this vast, unfinished underworld remains a mystery. No official documentation on the project's final goal has ever been found. Was it intended to be a series of underground factories for producing V-2 rockets or other wonder weapons? Or was it, as many historians believe, destined to be a final, impregnable Führerhauptquartier, a subterranean fortress from which Hitler and the Nazi High Command could direct the final, apocalyptic stages of the war? Whatever its purpose, the existence of Project Riese proves that the Nazis had the technology, the resources, and the ruthless will to create exactly the kind of secret, hidden tunnel that the gold train legend requires. It provides the essential historical backdrop that elevates the story from a simple myth into a compelling and terrifying possibility. The Plunder Express, wartime railway logistics, and gold transport myths. The existence of a vast, secret tunnel system proved that the Nazis had the means to hide a train. But did they have the motive and the opportunity? To answer this, we must move from the realm of geology and local legend into the cold, hard reality of wartime logistics. The enduring power of the gold train myth lies in its plausibility, and this plausibility is rooted in the very real and well-documented Nazi practice of using trains to transport the immense wealth they had plundered from a conquered Europe. The concept of a Nazi gold train is not a fantasy. The most famous, documented example is the Hungarian gold train, a train of 24 freight cars filled with the stolen wedding rings, jewelry, gold, and priceless art belonging to the Hungarian Jews, which was intercepted by American forces in Austria in 1945. The Nazis regularly used their state railway, the Reichsbahn, as a continental conveyor belt for plundered goods. Special armored trains, or Panzerzüge, were a common feature on the Eastern Front. These were not just simple locomotives. They were mobile fortresses, bristling with machine gun nests, anti-aircraft cannons, and sometimes even artillery pieces, mounted in armored turrets, all designed to protect valuable cargo and patrol railway lines against partisan attacks. The idea of loading plundered treasure onto just such a train is not just possible. It is historically logical. However, the specific legend of a single train, laden entirely with tons of solid gold, begins to fray when examined under the lens of logistics. Gold is one of the densest materials on Earth. A single standard freight car could hold a fortune of almost unimaginable value, but it would also weigh a staggering amount, putting immense strain on both the wagon and the tracks. It is far more likely that any real treasure train would have carried a mixed and more manageable cargo, some gold from the Reichsbank, certainly, but also crates of currency, plundered art, industrial materials, and secret documents. Furthermore, the idea of such a high-value train simply vanishing from all records is a major sticking point for historians. The movement of a Panzerzug was a significant military operation. It would have required high-level authorization, a dedicated and elite crew, and would have been tracked by railway officials along its entire route. For all records of its crew, its cargo, and its very existence to disappear requires us to believe in a conspiracy of silence so perfect that it left not a single trace in the vast, meticulous bureaucracy of the Nazi state. While the chaos of the final days of the war could explain some missing documents, the complete absence of any official record is deeply suspicious. And so, the slow examination of wartime logistics leaves us with a nuanced conclusion. The idea of one or more high-value, secret armored trains attempting to evacuate treasure from the besieged city of Breslau is entirely plausible. But the myth of a single, solid, gold train, a fairy tale treasure on wheels, is likely just that, a myth, an exaggeration of a more complex and desperate historical reality. Gold fever. The global media frenzy begins. For 70 years, the story of the gold train had been a local secret, a ghost story whispered in a forgotten corner of Lower Silesia. But in August of 2015, the moment Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter filed their legal claim with the authorities, that local secret was thrown onto the world stage. The act of seeking an official permit was like lighting a match in a room filled with dry tinder. The story contained a perfect, irresistible combination of elements: Nazis, a secret tunnel, a deathbed confession, scientific proof in the form of a radar image, and the most powerful, alluring element of all, gold. It was a story almost too good to be true, and therefore, it was a story the global media could not possibly resist. At first, the news trickled out in local Polish papers, but within days, it was picked up by international news agencies: Reuters, the BBC, CNN, The Guardian. Every major news outlet in the world suddenly had a correspondent reporting from the small, unassuming town of Wałbrzych. The legend was no longer a whisper. It was a headline, broadcast in dozens of languages to hundreds of millions of people. A full-blown gold fever gripped the public imagination. The quiet, forested railway embankment at the 65-kilometer was transformed, almost overnight, into the center of the world's attention. The scene on the ground became a circus of chaotic excitement and speculation. Satellite trucks from international television networks parked along the country roads. Their dishes pointed to the sky, beaming the latest developments to a global audience. Journalists with cameras and microphones tramped through the woods, trying to get a glimpse of the supposedly historic site. The Polish government, caught off guard by the intensity of the interest, was forced to deploy military police to secure the area, not just to protect the potential treasure, but to stop an influx of illegal, amateur treasure hunters who descended on the region with their own metal detectors, hoping to find a loose coin or artifact. The local community of Wałbrzych, a town that had struggled economically since the closure of its coal mines, was suddenly a major tourist destination. Entrepreneurs began selling gold train-themed souvenir chocolate bars, shaped like gold ingots, and t-shirts emblazoned with the ghostly radar image. This intense, global spotlight had a profound and irreversible effect on the search. On the one hand, it gave Koper and Richter's project a level of credibility and momentum it would never have otherwise had. The media frenzy attracted potential investors needed to fund the multi-million-dollar excavation. On the other hand, it put the two men and the Polish authorities under immense and unforgiving pressure. Every statement was scrutinized, every delay was questioned, and every skeptical expert was given a global platform. The search for the train had ceased to be a private, historical quest. It had become a public spectacle, a self-perpetuating cycle of hype and expectation. The legend was no longer theirs to control. It now belonged to the world. The first cut initial trenches and preliminary findings. After nearly a year of navigating the bureaucratic maze, of battling for permits and placating a dozen different government agencies, the moment of truth had finally arrived. In the late summer of 2016, with the eyes of the world's media upon them, Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter were finally allowed to begin digging. But this was not the grand, dramatic excavation that many had imagined. It was not a quest to immediately unearth a train of gold. Instead, it was a slow, cautious, and deeply methodical preliminary investigation, a scientific procedure designed to answer one simple question: was there any physical, tangible evidence of a man-made tunnel beneath the surface, or was the tantalizing anomaly on the ground penetrating radar merely a ghost in the machine, a trick of the digital light? The process began with a painstaking and deliberate clearing of the site. Trees that had grown on the embankment for 70 years had to be carefully cut down and their roots removed, all under the watchful eye of preservation officials to ensure the minimum possible disturbance to the surrounding ground. A precise, three-dimensional grid was then laid out across the entire area, a network of strings and stakes that transformed the wooded hillside into a scientific crime scene. Every spoonful of earth, every stone, every fragment of debris removed from this point forward would have its exact location and depth meticulously recorded. This was not a treasure hunt. It was a slow-motion forensic investigation, and the first cut into the earth was like the first careful incision in an autopsy. The plan was to dig 3 deep, narrow exploratory trenches, cutting across the location of the GPR anomaly from different angles. This would allow the team of geologists and archaeologists to read the story told by the layers of the earth, a discipline known as stratigraphy. As the excavators slowly scraped away the soil, the scientists would examine the trench walls, looking for the telltale signs of a backfilled tunnel. They were searching for a cut, a clear line where the natural, undisturbed layers of ancient soil and clay had been sliced through and then backfilled with a different, more chaotic mixture of rock and earth. This would be the undeniable fingerprint of a large-scale, man-made excavation from the past. The work was slow, tedious, and filled with a quiet, mounting tension. Each bucket of earth removed by the mechanical digger was carefully inspected. Every shovelful was sifted through fine mesh screens, a monotonous but essential task designed to catch any small, forgotten clues. The team was looking for anything that did not belong: a rusted nail, a fragment of wire, a piece of German concrete, even a simple lump of coal from a steam locomotive. Anything that could prove human activity from the 1940s. But the days turned into weeks, and the trenches grew deeper, yet no definitive evidence was found. There was no sign of a tunnel entrance, no retaining walls, no railway tracks. The earth remained stubbornly, frustratingly silent. The preliminary findings, when they finally came, were a masterpiece of ambiguity. The geologists did confirm that the ground was anomalous. They found pockets of non-native clay and rock types, suggesting that the embankment was not an entirely natural formation, and that some kind of large-scale earthworks had indeed taken place there at some point in the past. This was the tantalizing crumb of hope that the treasure hunters seized upon. But the archaeologists found nothing. No artifacts from the correct time period, and most crucially, no evidence of a collapsed tunnel structure. The first cut had provided no easy answers. It had not revealed a train, but it had not completely debunked the legend either. It was an anticlimax that only served to deepen the mystery, prolong the obsession, and set the stage for a far bigger, far more expensive, and ultimately, far more disastrous excavation to come. Years in limbo, the long wait for the great excavation. The first cut into the earth had ended not with a bang, but with a deeply unsatisfying question mark. The initial feverish excitement of 2015, fueled by the ghostly radar image, had evaporated in the inconclusive mud of the exploratory trenches. The world's media, having found no immediate treasure, packed up their satellite trucks and moved on to the next sensational story, leaving the treasure hunters in a state of frustrating limbo. The dig had revealed just enough evidence of disturbed ground to keep the legend alive, but it had failed to produce the smoking, gun the tunnel, the track, the train that was needed to maintain momentum and silence the growing chorus of skeptics. What followed was not a period of exciting discovery, but a long, slow, and grinding war of attrition, a years-long struggle against doubt, debt, and bureaucracy. The first casualty of this anticlimax was the partnership of the two finders themselves, Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter. The men who had brought the legend to the world had a public and acrimonious falling out, splitting into two separate, competing factions. The search was now fractured, its energy dissipated by infighting and recriminations. This human drama only made the official process more complicated. The Polish authorities, who had been swept up in the initial excitement, now grew more cautious and demanded an even higher standard of proof before they would consider issuing permits for a larger, more destructive, and far more expensive excavation. The war of paper, which had delayed the first dig, now returned with a vengeance. The greatest battle, however, was a financial one. A full-scale excavation involving heavy earth-moving equipment, geological consultants, and round-the-clock security would cost millions of dollars. The initial investors were now wary. Koper and his team were forced to embark on a new, far less glamorous quest, a slow, humbling, and relentless search for funding. This was a period of endless meetings, of crafting business proposals, of pleading with potential sponsors, and of trying to sell the dream of a lost Nazi treasure to a world that was rapidly losing interest. They set up foundations, courted private benefactors, and tried to keep the story alive in the press, all in a desperate attempt to raise the capital needed for one final, all-or-nothing attempt to prove their theory. At the same time, a slow, academic war was being fought in the pages of scientific journals. Geologists and archaeologists from prestigious institutions like the AGH, University of Science and Technology in Krakow, conducted their own independent surveys of the site. Their conclusions were sober and damning. They published papers arguing that the famous GPR anomaly was not a train, but a natural geological formation, likely the result of glacial deposits from the last ice age. The treasure hunters, in turn, would counter with their own expert analyses, defending their data and their interpretation. It was a quiet, technical, and deeply tedious battle of competing scientific claims, a war of words that did little to bring the search any closer to a definitive conclusion. And so, for years, the project existed in this state of limbo court between a tantalizing legend and a frustrating lack of proof, between the unwavering belief of a small group of determined searchers and the cold skepticism of the scientific establishment. The big dig mobilizing the heavy machinery, After years spent wandering in a wilderness of bureaucracy, financial struggle, and academic debate, the moment finally arrived. In the summer of 2018, having finally secured the necessary funding from private backers and a new, comprehensive set of permits from a weary government, Piotr Koper and his dedicated team were ready to begin the final act. The years of limbo were over. This would not be a cautious, exploratory dig with small trenches. This was to be the big dig, a full-scale, multi-million-dollar excavation, an industrial-scale assault on the Earth, designed to settle the question of the gold train once and for all. The atmosphere at the 65-kilometer was transformed. The quiet, wooded railway embankment, which had returned to a state of overgrown neglect after the first dig, was once again swarmed with activity. This time, the global media presence was more muted, more skeptical, but they were still there, their cameras ready to capture either a historic discovery or a spectacular failure. The real change was the machinery. A convoy of massive, heavy-duty construction equipment began to arrive, their diesel engines rumbling through the Polish countryside. Great yellow excavators with massive articulated arms, powerful bulldozers to clear the land, and a fleet of dump trucks to haul away the thousands of tons of earth, all began to assemble at the site. This was no longer a simple treasure hunt. It was a major civil engineering project. The plan was complex and fraught with risk. The team had to dig a massive, open pit, over 50 feet deep and hundreds of feet long, to reach the depth of the anomaly identified by the radar. But they had to do so while ensuring the absolute stability of the main railway line, which ran along the top of the embankment just a few feet away from the edge of their proposed excavation. Engineers designed a system of terraced levels and reinforced retaining walls to prevent a catastrophic collapse. The logistical challenge was immense. As the first great excavator fired up its engine, a palpable sense of finality settled over the site. This was it. This was the culmination of the deathbed confession, the tantalizing radar image, and the decade of obsessive belief. Every person there, from Koper and his team to the machine operators and the handful of remaining journalists, knew that this was the all-or-nothing moment. The slow, careful work of the geologists and the endless arguments of the bureaucrats were over. The time for talking had passed. The only thing left to do was to move the earth, to peel back the layers of soil and clay, and to finally see, with their own eyes, what secrets, if any, the ground had been holding for 70 years. The great dig had begun, a methodical descent, boring excavation protocols and safety mandates. The great machines were in place. The world was watching, and the ground was finally being opened. But the reality of the big dig was a world away from the frantic, gold fever-fueled fantasies that had inspired it. The process of excavating a potentially historic and dangerous site is not a rapid, dramatic affair. It is a slow, painstaking, and deeply methodical descent, governed by a rigid set of archaeological protocols and safety mandates that prioritize evidence and safety over speed and excitement. Every day on the site was a masterclass in this tedious but essential discipline. The work was not a simple rush to the bottom. The massive excavators, with their powerful hydraulic arms, would peel back the earth in thin, controlled layers, or spits, often no more than a few inches deep at a time. After each layer was removed from a section of the great pit, the heavy machinery would fall silent. An archaeologist, legally required to be on site at all times, would then descend into the pit to examine the newly exposed surface. They would scrape the soil with a trowel, reading the subtle changes in its color and texture, searching for the telltale signs of a tunnel roof or a man-made structure. This was the slow, repetitive rhythm of the dig, the roar of the engines, followed by a period of quiet, intense scrutiny. With every foot they descended, the team was engaged in a process of ground truthing, the digital ghost that had started their quest. They were constantly comparing the physical reality of the geology with the tantalizing, train-shaped anomaly that had appeared on the ground, penetrating radar. But as they dug deeper, a sense of confusion and doubt began to grow. The clear, hard lines of the radar image were not translating into a clear, hard reality. There was no sign of a massive, metallic object. There was no discovery of a collapsed concrete tunnel. There was only earth, clay, and scattered, natural rock formations. The process was made even slower by the strict safety requirements. The steep, 50-foot walls of the excavation pit had to be constantly monitored by engineers for any signs of instability or potential collapse. The Polish military's bomb disposal experts remained on site, and after each layer of earth was removed, they would sweep the area with detectors, searching for the unexploded bombs, mines, or shells that could have turned the entire project into a catastrophe with one careless scoop of the excavator's bucket. This painstaking, safety-first approach was non-negotiable, and it meant that the descent into the earth was a slow, deliberate, and incredibly expensive crawl. For the crew on the ground, it was a daily grind of long hours, repetitive work, and a slow, draining cycle of hope each morning that slowly gave way to a quiet disappointment each evening as they found nothing but more soil and more rock. The methodical, scientific process that was supposed to lead them to the train was instead revealing a frustrating and ever-deepening void. The silence of the earth, the anticlimactic reality of the 65th kilometer. The descent was complete. After days of methodical, painstaking work, of peeling back the earth layer by agonizing layer, the great excavation pit had reached its target depth. They were now at the heart of the anomaly, the precise location where the ground-penetrating radar had painted its ghostly, tantalizing image of an armored train resting in a hidden tunnel. The heavy machinery fell silent for the last time. A hush fell over the site. The crew, the remaining journalists, and the searchers themselves all held their breath, their eyes fixed on the bottom of the 50-foot pit. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of a 70-year-old legend, a 10-year modern obsession, and a multi-million-dollar gamble. The Earth was finally ready to give up its secret. The secret, as it turned out, was that there was no secret at all. There was no tunnel. There was no track. There was no train. As the final layers of soil were carefully scraped away by archaeologists, the team was met with the sight of undisturbed, virgin bedrock and natural layers of dense, blue-grey clay. There was no sign of human activity from the 1940s, no evidence of a collapsed structure, no fragments of steel or concrete. There was nothing. The digital ghost on the radar, the image that had launched a global media frenzy and a massive engineering project, corresponded to absolutely nothing in the physical world. The team continued to dig, pushing further and deeper, driven by a desperate hope that their calculations were off by a few feet. But the result was the same. The silence of the Earth was the final, definitive, and deeply anticlimactic answer. The official scientific explanation, offered by the independent geologist from Krakow University who had been skeptical all along, was sober and simple. The train-shaped anomaly that had looked so convincing on the GPR screen was a natural geological formation. They concluded it was likely a deep channel, carved by a subglacial stream during the last ice age tens of thousands of years ago, which had then been filled in with different densities of clay and sediment. This natural feature, when viewed through the interpretive lens of a GPR scanner, had coincidentally and cruelly created a shape that looked like a tunnel with a train inside it, a geological Rorschach test onto which the searchers had projected their deepest hopes. For Piotr Koper and his team, it was a moment of profound and public failure. After years of unwavering belief, of fighting skeptics, of raising funds, and of battling bureaucracy, they were forced to confront the empty pit and the crushing weight of reality. The quest was over. The legend, at least in this specific location, was a bust. They had spent a decade of their lives and a fortune chasing a ghost, only to prove that the ghost was never there. The great excavation had ended not with a hoard of Nazi gold, but with a quiet, expensive, and deeply humbling lesson in the difference between a beautiful legend and the cold, hard, and often empty ground of truth, the aftermath, the blame, the debt, and the official conclusion. The silence of the empty pit was soon replaced by a new and far more human noise, the cacophony of blame, ridicule, and financial ruin. As the great excavators were dismantled and the heavy trucks began to haul away the equipment, a profound and awkward quiet settled over the 65-kilometer. The last of the world's media packed up their cameras, their story now having a definitive, if deeply unsatisfying, ending. For the searchers, the long, adrenaline-fueled dream was over, and the harsh, cold morning of the aftermath was just beginning. Piotr Koper and his team, who had been celebrated as heroic visionaries just a few years earlier, now faced a torrent of public and academic scorn. The scientists and geologists from Krakow University, who had been skeptical from the start and had warned that the anomaly was likely a natural formation, were publicly vindicated. Their sober, scientific caution had been proven correct, and the treasure hunters were cast in the role of deluded amateurs who had been fooled by a geological Rorschach test. The Polish government, having spent considerable time and resources overseeing the dig, officially closed their investigation, declaring that there was definitively no train in the location indicated. But the most brutal consequence was the financial one. The big dig had been a multi-million-dollar undertaking, funded by a collection of private investors and sponsors who had gambled on the legend. With the discovery of nothing but clay and rock, that money was gone forever. The project was left with massive, crippling debts, and the searchers themselves faced financial ruin. The grand quest for Nazi gold had ended not with a treasure chest, but with a pile of invoices and the threat of bankruptcy court. It was a deeply human and tragic end to a decade-long obsession. And yet, for some of the true believers, the dream did not die, even in the face of the empty pit. For a time, they clung to the hope that their calculations had been slightly off, that the train was just a few meters to the side, or buried even deeper than they could reach. Because for some, the power of such a legend is more compelling than the hard reality of an empty hole. The official conclusion was clear, but the myth itself, having been given such a massive global stage, had taken on a life of its own, the enduring power of a golden legend. And so, we are left with the story of a train that was never found, a treasure that likely never was, and a 10-year journey that ended in an empty pit of mud and rock. What then is the ultimate meaning of this modern treasure hunt? What is the final lesson to be learned from the great Polish gold train disaster? It is a story that tells us less about the secrets of the Second World War, and more about the enduring and seductive power of a perfect legend in our own time. We have followed the entire arc of this obsession, from its plausible birth in the genuine chaos and plunder of 1945 to its long, quiet life as a piece of local folklore. We witnessed its dramatic resurrection, sparked by the tantalizing whispers of a deathbed confession, and given the veneer of scientific proof by the ghostly image on a radar screen. We followed the long, frustrating war against bureaucracy, the global explosion of gold fever, and the slow, methodical, and deeply boring reality of a modern geological and archaeological investigation. And we stood at the end, at the edge of the pit, and were met with a profound and anticlimactic silence. The story of the Polish gold train is, in the end, not really about a train at all. It is a story about the human need to believe that there are still great, romantic secrets lying just beneath the surface of our rational, well-mapped modern world. The legend was so powerful because it contained all the elements of a perfect fairy tale, the dark villains of the Nazi regime, a secret underground world, and a lost treasure of unimaginable wealth. It was a story people wanted to be true. The Great Excavation was a massive, expensive, and ultimately failed attempt to drag that fairy tale out into the light of day. But the result, the empty pit, did not necessarily kill the legend. It only killed the possibility of it being in that one specific place. And so, the ghost on the rails is free, once more, to haunt the imagination. It has returned to the realm to which it has always belonged, not the hard ground of history, but the soft, fertile, and ever hopeful landscape of myth.